Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. The Austrian Grand Prix is over, Ferrari have taken their second victory on the bounce and Charles Leclerc is first since way back in Australia, but Max Verstappen, after what was shaping up to be a pretty dominant weekend from start to finish, fell short of the race pace required on Sunday. Why was that the case? Many sources explaining exactly why from inside the Red Bull side, but also whether this could be a potential issue as time progresses this season as Leclerc closes the gap for the championship lead. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you are new as always. Had so many new subs yesterday, so yeah, really appreciate it guys. Now look, not a clean weekend for many teams, pretty much every team, no team had a clean weekend here. Certainly not Ferrari either, we'll discuss this image here in a second. But yeah, before the race even began, there was some issue for Hamilton, they were pretty sure bleeding his brakes a little bit. They had some problems there because he had some issues with his brakes after the crash, or the collision, let's just say, with Gasly that we looked at in yesterday's video during the sprint race, and it seemed to be shaping up for a rather similar story in the race here actually. And what this of course was the grid before everything kicked off. And honestly, on the first lap there was again an incident, Russell pretty much copying and pasting what's happened in previous years with Mercedes and Red Bulls at this very corner. Russell taking Perez out of the race. Difficult incident really, I think, coming here into turn 4, because often on new tyres that aren't particularly well warmed up, it's so difficult to go into this corner and not oversteer wide. Russell was doing his best to turn into this corner. Of course, Perez was ahead in this corner. I think you can very much argue that it was Russell's fault, and in previous instances and later on in the race itself, it is usually determined that the driver who pushes the other car off it is deemed at fault, and Russell got a 5-second penalty for this incident, as is generally the precedent with incidents at this corner. But yeah, Perez goes off the track and actually suffers some damage from this. Even Russell got his end plate knocked off as well on his front wing, which certainly kind of effectively caused a DRS train behind him, and he was losing an awful lot of time per lap to the Ferraris ahead. But yeah, this effectively puts Perez out of the race. Once he got back in the race, he was effectively all the way at the back, had some further damage, and had blue flags, and eventually he realised that he wasn't going to get into the points, and they retired the car not too far into the race. But honestly, we did talk about it yesterday, right, that during the sprint race, Verstappen's tyres towards the end did seem to go away from him, the gap closed from about 3 seconds, only a few laps into the sprint race to about 1.5 seconds at the end. And I was theorising, right, that if it hadn't been for that Ferrari tussle early on in the sprint, whether, maybe Leclerc could have taken Max or would have been there or thereabouts with him at the end of the race. Only 12 laps into this race, Leclerc makes his first of 3 moves on Verstappen for the lead in this race. And again, the tyres seem to go away from Verstappen very quickly indeed. The fact that he pitted on lap, 14 on the mediums was a massive surprise, and pretty much every other car on the grid, the Mercedes and the Ferraris, seemed to be able to go at least 10 laps further than that. So that was a key concern, because earlier this season, the previous sprint race we saw in Imola, it was the other way around, where the Ferrari was, harder on its tyres, and we saw in that race it was effectively the opposite of what happened this weekend, where it was the Ferraris quick off the line, and then as the race progressed in Imola, Verstappen came back with seemingly better tyres and overtook Leclerc for the lead. This weekend it was the other way around, whereas actually the Ferrari had the better race pace than the Red Bull. Pretty much the first time we've seen that, right? And so far this year, going into this, what was the 11th race, it's been out of 10 races, 7 poles for Ferrari, 3 race victories, and then of course the other way around for Red Bull, 7 race victories, just 3 poles. If that tide changes through the second half of the season, where it's actually the Ferrari that's the faster race car, the championship is well and truly on. There was a lot going on here, right? Because of course Russell had to pit, he got a new front wing, he had to battle himself back through the field. There was some absolute madness going right here. Look at this, right? We've got 5 cars barreling down into turn 3 together, which is kind of incredible. Some of the racing that we saw, there was so much honestly going on all across the track. It was exciting, and it's kind of funny because Russell was P4 in qualifying, P4 in the sprint, and P4 in the race, but actually had one of his most eventful weekends so far this season. So eventually, honestly, Ferrari from a strategic perspective nailed this weekend, right? I was watching Ferrari thinking, okay, how are they going to mess this up? And they pretty much nailed it, because Verstappen had to pit super early on both his early set of mediums and his then first set of hards. They effectively 2-stopped it. I think they might have 3-stopped it actually, just because there was a VSC at the end, of course, for the Sainz issue we'll discuss here in a second. But Ferrari made a good call. They kept their cars out a little bit longer than Verstappen. By the time Leclerc hit the road again after his new set of hard tyres, he was so much quicker than Verstappen, right? Used tyres immediately, even just a few laps into the stint, seemed to be going away from him a bit. Leclerc passes for the lead again on lap 32 and maintains that, and it looked certain really that Sainz was going to get Verstappen as well, especially towards the end of the race, that we'll see here in a second. So again on lap 37, Verstappen has to pit for another set of hard tyres, just showing that the degradation there, this was predicted by Pirelli to be a one-stop race, and that was a very different story to what actually happened here. So yeah, definitely big questions going to be raised about the Red Bull, because we didn't really get to see what it was like for Perez, but for Verstappen, apart from the very end of the race, he was nowhere near the kind of race pace required to keep up with the Ferraris, right? And honestly, if a Hamilton hadn't got kind of held up early on with the Russell train and some other issues that he had, if they'd have been on equal tyres, I wonder, like, you know, how much time Hamilton would have really lost to Verstappen at the end if the safety car didn't come out the way it did. Now, this, of course, is, again, like, as soon as this happened, right, Sainz was closing in rapidly on Verstappen. It seemed almost certain that he was going to get past and it was going to be a Ferrari 1-2. And then, again, just like we saw in Baku, the engine just completely explodes. Like, this was a full explosion as well. As the car came off the road here, like, everything was, it was going up in flames. It looked like a grenade had gone off in there, to be honest. Complete explosion. So they're going to have to look into that one. I'm sure there's another video to follow up on this sometime in the next 24 hours or so on exactly what went wrong here for Ferrari. And honestly, this was a scary moment because, like, Sainz had to kind of park it up on a hill. For some reason, the marshals kind of just ran away apart from this one lad, and he puts a stop effectively behind the front wheel to try and stop the car moving. But, you know, Sainz was putting the brakes on and trying to get out, and then the car was rolling back, and it was like, lads, please come and help me, as the fire was kind of engulfing him. Like, it was kind of a scary incident, but in the end, Sainz got out and it was all well. But, yeah, not ideal at all. And at the same time as that engine blows up for Sainz, Charles Leclerc starts to have an issue himself with the throttle pedal. Effectively, the way it was going, you can see this on the telemetry, that the throttle was often on about 10, 15, even 20% activation, even when he was fully off the throttle, right? So for whatever reason, it wasn't coming all the way back to neutral, and that's like, you're going into a corner, you're trying to brake heavily, and your throttle's still active, going to give you a lot of understeer, really difficult to control. His engineer was telling him, like, maybe even put your foot underneath the throttle and try and bring it back all the way, because the spring isn't doing the job, which, I mean, yeah, I'm sure he was so stressed about that, right? Because just a few laps after the VSC ends, he's got to deal about Verstappen on actual good pace on those mediums at the ends, closing in from behind, and the stress of really needing to win this race, and the fact that your teammates just had an engine issue, and the fact that the throttle pedal isn't working. So, you know, well managed from all involved. Heartbreak for Sainz, of course, after winning last weekend. Crazy how quickly things can turn around for a season. But yes, in the end, Leclerc just about holds off Verstappen. And of course, I wonder, without the throttle issue, whether the gap would have probably maintained itself or even grown, who knows? Because Verstappen, give him a few more laps after the race ended, you'd have thought he might have caught Leclerc. But then again, if his tyres were going off the way they did in the first stint, then it might have been the other way around. Ferrari's first victory at this circuit since way back in 2003. And yeah, Charles Leclerc, a massively important victory in terms of their championship hunt, right? And as I always pointed out, he was incredibly scared at the end of that race. But the key talking point really was, like, of course, yes, Ferrari come away with a victory, but the fact of the matter is that on Friday and on Saturday, it was Max Verstappen and Red Bull setting the pace, and I think they were pretty much odds-on favourites here to walk away with the victory today. Certainly the bookies' favourites, but as it turned out, it was not the weekend they were looking for. Now look, at the end of the day, despite what the Formula 1 guys say is on the podium here, it's really not, a good damage limitation again here for Verstappen, right? Despite having a difficult weekend, ends up P2, thanks to Ferrari's misery with of course, Carlos Sainz, and, well, Verstappen even takes the fastest lap as well, and he won the sprint race, so on the whole, he only lost 5 points this weekend to Charles Leclerc, but still, those points totals are starting to add up, and if we see this trend that we've seen this weekend continue for the rest of the season, then of course this championship is still far from over. Got a shout out Mick Schumacher though, driver of the day, no questions. Like, honestly, early on, Hamilton made a mistake, Schumacher got him, then Hamilton made a great move on Schumacher to get him back a little bit later on, but man, Mick, since getting his points in Silverstone, has been a completely different beast. You can see this guy is driven, he's got a bit of that kind of villain persona coming out as well, seems to have a lot of passion right now, a lot of energy, and well, he comes P6 this race. What a performance, honestly, from both Haas drivers, P6, P8. But yeah, of course, the Red Bull, big discussion on them, what was going on here, and Christian Horner kind of gives his thoughts on the matter, saying they will bounce back, but talking about the massive tyre deg they seem to have early on, and even Max Verstappen said it was more tricky than he expected, like having to pit so early was a massive surprise, and yeah, just didn't have the pace to defend.
At the end there, but our tyre deg, was higher from halfway through the first stint, and it was hard to combat that.
Was that something you saw yesterday in the sprint, or did it just suddenly arrive today?
Nowhere near what we saw today. So, Ferrari just seemed lighter on the tyres, and obviously they had a pace advantage, and then that gives you more strategic options.
You were saying the car's so unpredictable, and
better than expected. I mean, if you look at the whole race, we were lacking pace, just a lot of deg, and I don't really understand why it was that bad. Of course, it looked like Carlos was also going to overtake me, but then unfortunately, of course, he encountered engine trouble, and at the end, I think only lose 5 points over a weekend is not too bad, on a bad day. So it's been a bit more tricky than I expected it to be today, but sometimes these things can happen.
What was unpredictable about it?
Just no grip, and I could not manage my tires like I want to, because they were just degrading a lot.
Do you think then that Ferrari have the edge at the moment on pace, or do you think that was just around this circuit and that you think you're pretty close going forward?
Really difficult to tell, but it seemed like we really had a bit of an off day, and they had a very strong day.
Now, Helmut Marko says also from the Red Bull side, we had an incredible amount of wear, except on that last set of tyres. Then we were suddenly fast again. But we are not worried. It's not like we suddenly lose the championship here. So interesting, really, like I guess towards the end of the race with low fuel, maybe on a low fuel setup with those kind of medium tyres, Verstappen was okay and didn't suffer the same issues. But maybe at the start of the race on kind of more fuel, and it's kind of interesting really because the degradation seemed to be worse in the race here than it was in the sprint race yesterday. And maybe that is kind of a fuel thing, right? Because of course high fuel, heavier cars at the start of this race than they were in the sprint race yesterday, because you need less fuel of course for the sprint race and more for the actual race. And all of a sudden when there's more fuel in the car, the degradation seemed to be absolutely immense and kind of tailed off towards the end of the race. So certainly a key talking point here. And as Helmut Marko says, not that the championship has been lost by any means, but if the tides do turn now that Ferrari is the quicker race car and suffers less degradation, then of course that's a big deal. And yes, it could just be circuit specific. We'll see how Red Bull go in Paul Ricard and beyond, but this could still be a critical turning point weekend, right? Because Charles Leclerc never in his career, out of I believe the 4 races he won so far, all of those 4 races he won in his career up until today were from pole position. Today's the first time we started on not on pole and actually won a race. And that of course is a key statistic that Ferrari will be very happy about as the season moves forward, right? So yeah, Tyre Degradation was much higher from halfway through the first stint, and it was hard to combat that, right? And they saw this was an issue, right? We talked about this as a problem after the sprint race, and I was kind of wondering if they would think about how to manage that going into the race itself, but whatever they tried or whatever ideas they came up with obviously didn't work, and Ferrari practically dominated and would have got a P1, P2 here, a 1-2 finish, if not for the engine issues that Sainz suffered. So definitely tweeting your thoughts on this in the comment section below. Will this be a consistent trend? Was it just kind of a one-off for this particular track, right? But the concern to me is for Ferrari, right, that even if this is a consistent trend and Ferrari are now just the faster race car out of nowhere, right, and they all of a sudden are winning all the races, there's still at least a couple of DNFs in here for Leclerc, right? If the engine's going to keep doing this for Sainz, it's going to do it again for Leclerc, and like they can't afford to lose another 25 points. They can maybe go the rest of the season like with Leclerc winning every race and Verstappen P2 and still win the championship, but like they can't afford another DNF, right? So that I think is the key concern that they still have. Like I think on the whole, Red Bull will still be somewhat happier than Ferrari here because the concern is still there, but it's still a positive weekend for Ferrari nonetheless, but far from a clean one. This was the overall pace as well. Verstappen marginally the slower car, but I think this doesn't really take into account everything because this also includes the final stint on those kind of tyres that the Red Bull seemed better on the lower fuel mileage, but still earlier on in the race there were periods where Leclerc was lapping much faster. Sainz of course is kind of skewed because he didn't have that period at the end on the newer tyres. Same with Hamilton and Russell because they weren't really able to pit at the end for a new set of medium, so they kind of lost out here in terms of race pace comparisons, but it's really the points of course that are scored at the end of the day that are the big deal. But yeah, feel bad for Carlos Sainz after this weekend. It's crazy how cruel Formula 1 world is, or really how cruel it is driving for Ferrari when you come out of one weekend and win it, but still look, back-to-back victories for Ferrari. They're certainly still going to be concerned about reliability, but we'll be happy about the direction they're currently taking, right? So yeah, Sainz frustrated, bit lost for words. Even Leclerc goes on to say we obviously need to look at what happened on Carlos's side because reliability is still a problem. We need to get on top of it because reliability is still a key issue. Obviously, they need to get on top of it. If Leclerc has another DNF, like he's going to move to Mercedes when Hamilton retires. I don't know what he's going to do, but like look, maybe he's going to get his confidence back in the team here because finally a relatively clean weekend at least for Charles Leclerc's side of the garage. And these were the final classifications. Many points of note here actually. Both McLarens getting in the point. Alonso honestly could have maybe got like a P6 or something if it wasn't for like kind of a feature they messed up his pit stop. One of the wheels was loose and he had to pit again on the very next lap. Like he made a great recovery drive but got P10. Bottas actually got pipped to the line in the end naturally because Alonso I'm pretty sure overtook him on the final lap. Latifi retired. Sainz, Perez of course out of the race early on. Vettel got spun up by Gasly. There were a load of like track limit violations going on here, but Hamilton and Russell, they come through for a podium. This is what they always do, right? Like they're always there to pick up the pieces when the other teams have a difficult time, and this is what it means for the drivers standing. So Leclerc the last 2 races has closed in about 11-12 points on Verstappen's lead. It's now only 38 points. He now takes P2 as well in the drivers championship. So still this would have been big for Sainz to get points here actually because that would have closed up the constructors. Seems like Red Bull are still probably going to win that one, but yeah, the fight for the World Drivers' Championship is still very much on. A 38 point gap is not massive when you consider there's 11 races left this season. We're at the halfway points officially now. Very much intrigued to your thoughts down below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new as always. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you next time.